All right, so you just got done going through the 7 steps of how to approach an interview with an example. And then hopefully you were able to watch 4 different instances of a mock interview where you can kind of see some strengths and weaknesses of some different specific interview techniques. I'm going to summarize those with giving you some tips and listing out some common mistakes. So, how to prepare for the interview. You want to definitely review your fundamentals, and you also want to pick your strongest coding language. So, in this class we use C++, and so, anytime you need to write code, you're going to write it in C++. But maybe that's not your strongest coding language, particularly if you go off into your upper division classes. If you start using Java, Java is a really great language. It's really, really friendly. Python is a great language, and you can choose whichever one you want in a lot of cases. Some companies that want you to be programming in a particular language, they might ask you to do your coding interview in that language, but a lot of the big companies are going to let you choose your strongest. Practice the interviews. So oftentimes these interviews are going to be on a shared document, over Zoom with a share screen, or on a whiteboard. So practice doing that. Solve your problems in those scenarios. If you have any need to have an accommodation during your interview, do definitely let your interviewer know. I think that's something people don't know. So if you are registered with an LOA at UIC, in industry they will be accommodating in exactly the same way. So let them know right away when the recruiter contacts you, so that the people interviewing you can accommodate that as well. This is a list of the top 10 mistakes in the, I'm pretty sure this is from, I didn't cite this, but I'm pretty sure it's from this book, Cracking the Coding Interview, which I'll talk about in the resources page. But this is top 10 mistakes. A big one is that a lot of these interviews have been on whiteboards for a long time, and it's kind of weird because we're now in a state where they're not on whiteboards, and I don't know that any companies are using a touch screen to replace it, in any sort of way. I think probably everyone is typing the code on the computer. So previously, a huge barrier for a lot of people is that they're writing their codes on whiteboards. So when and if we ever go back, that's the number one mistake, is only practicing to code on a computer and never writing it out. Those are very different things, and you really have to plan it out. So if we ever go back to writing our coding interviews on whiteboards, make sure you practice that. It's just simple things like leaving enough space to write in between lines, working on your handwriting. Writing on a whiteboard is even different than writing on a piece of paper. It's really fun. If you've never done it and you want to, you should just try writing your code on a whiteboard before you code. It's an amazing way to write. It is so since it kind of moves your body as you're writing it, it's very energizing. And I really enjoy it. I mean, as a teacher, obviously I'm partial to the whiteboard. I've used it a lot throughout my career, and I used to do all my lectures on the whiteboard. So my whole lecture was me writing notes on the whiteboard, or even a chalkboard in some classrooms. And I really love it, but it's definitely a skill. So if you haven't done it before, it's really tough. Not rehearsing behavioral questions is a big mistake. Not ever practicing by doing a mock interview. It is just silly to think that you could go through a tech interview without ever practicing. It's not anything that anyone practices without some, very much an intention to do so. So obviously we're practicing them in this class, but normally you don't do that during school at all. So another thing that a lot of students do, or people, not students, when they're preparing for tech interviews, is they try to go through as many problems as possible and just memorize solutions. what I heard when I was at the faculty in residence is that at Google, if you already, and they tell you this when you're going through the process, if you already know the solution to a problem, you are obligated to tell your interviewer and they should pick a new question, indicating that it actually makes no sense to memorize solutions because they do not want you to already know the solution. That is not the point of the interview. They want to see you solve something that you do not know how to solve. It's such a waste of time in general to memorize solutions. It is much more important to practice solving problems. Not working on the talking out your problems as you're solving it. Rushing is a really common problem. Bad style, not testing, just being careless in general, but like seeing a mistake and then fixing it, rushing through it and fixing it carelessly, and then ultimately giving up. Going through just a couple of those common mistakes, a little bit more detail, or like a version of it. So I said rushing is a common mistake. So one example of this is jumping into code too soon. And in both of the mock interviews I showed you that were weak, they both did this. So you need to take that time at the beginning of the interview to think. You can't solve a problem without thinking. So spend some time discussing the question with the interviewer. It will buy you a lot of time to solve the problem. Make sure that you are solving the problem that they're asking for. If you remember with Buvni, she started solving a templated array, assuming that it needed to be general, and it didn't, and it wasted a bunch of time. They really want to see your process of solving the code. They don't just want to see a solution written out. That's not the point of the interview. It isn't even always necessary that you get to a solution if your path to the solution is really good. I've seen some really, really good interviews with really long problems. Actually, when I was at Google, they gave me a version of autocomplete but with binary trees, and I had to write the whole thing, and it was really long. It was a lot of code because I had to write a class and then I had to use it, and it ended up being like a whole whiteboard of code, and so I couldn't even write that fast to write that much code, so I didn't get through it and finish the whole code, but I got through most of it. I had some edge cases left, and that's okay. Testing is really, really important. So it's really good to test verbally first, especially because some of the testing can take a lot of time. Make sure that when you test, you pick simple examples. We saw that with Sam. He had picked some really long strings, which would have been really hard to trace. Make sure your test cases are really short so you can fully test them. But obviously they need to be complete, so they need to test the full functionality. But a lot of times we're talking about testing a string or an array, right? And so you don't need to have a really long one in order to test it thoroughly. Make sure you're always thinking about edge cases and error handling. Rarely does it happen that someone is doing too much of that, but I have seen a couple interviews where the person incessantly kept going through oh, well, what about this, what about this, what about this, and you don't want to go overboard with it, but rarely that's the case. Rarely it's that you aren't asking enough. Make sure you go over complexity. And time and space. Buvni talked a little bit about space and time. Sam didn't. It didn't really come at all into the conversation. It wasn't actually as relevant with Sam's problem because we weren't dealing with a container of data. We were just dealing with two strings. Yeah, and so don't forget to test your code. And then with all of this, it's always a balance. So don't do too many edge cases. Don't do too many examples. You want to find that nice balance. Another really common mistake, and I've actually seen this quite a few times. I went through and watched lots of mock interviews and real interviews, and a really common error is that people don't write real code, or they don't write with proper syntax, or they write with a mixture of real code and pseudocode. They want to see how you code, so you should be writing real code. Minor things don't matter. So if you are calling a member function and it doesn't exist, especially in abstractions that are really common, like vectors and lists and stuff. Like there's tons of implementations out there. So if you grab one that doesn't exist, or it's like one that exists, in a container that you've used a lot but isn't in the standard container, some of that doesn't matter so much. But if you're using a C array, that syntax better be correct, right? Like if you're using an integer, it has to be correct. If you're writing out a for loop, it has to be correct. So make sure that you are writing with real code. And one of the really good tips, I can't express how important this is this is not pseudocode to write helper functions. So you saw that with Buvni and Sam, that you do not need to write a sorting algorithm. So instead you're going to call a sort function, and then if there's time you'll implement it. You do not need to do excessive string parsing. No one wants to watch that. Write a function, and if you have time you can implement it, right? Searching. You don't need to write linear search. You don't need to write binary search. Now, ask the interviewer though, because in some cases they might want you to, and you can come back to it at the end. And if your code is really simple and there's not a lot to it, that might be exactly what they want you to write, and that's okay too. But if it's a bigger problem and that's just one piece of it, write a helper function. But don't write the function, just write the declaration. We didn't see this with either Sam or Buvni, but it is a common mistake to go to premature optimization. I guess actually you could kind of think of Buvni was actually doing this a little bit. So, she wasn't really talking out her thoughts, but she had this sense that she needed to sort and then, search in some way. So she just started sorting. And so she really went into this like code that was to her more optimal, but she wasn't explaining anything about it, and then she kind of got stuck. What could be worse is that you are thinking so much about the optimal solution, and you might have even come up with brute force solutions, but you never talked about them, but then you don't get the optimized solution working, and you don't even get it very close. Then you're kind of stuck, right? So there's nothing wrong with talking about the brute force solutions, and it really helps the process to talk about them. It also gives you the opportunity to talk a lot more about Big O and different things that you know. So it's a really good part of the conversation is to talk about the brute force solution, and there's probably a couple of them in a lot of cases. And so it's a nice way to also buy time to think of the optimal solution. As some final tips, interviews are really messy. So, even in the examples that I gave you that were strong interviews, there was lots of little errors and mistakes and things that it could have gone better. You're not going to have a perfect interview, probably, but you want to have a strong one. You want to show all those things that I said interviewers are looking for. Don't sweat small errors. Don't sweat missing a semicolon. Don't sweat having minor syntax that's wrong. You have to be careful about that, though. Syntax, there's a lot of different ways that syntax can be wrong. So calling the wrong member function, not a problem. But, you're doing something with pointers and you have the wrong, asterisk or ampersand. That's a big syntax error, right? So, syntax varies, depending on what you're doing, how important it is. But syntax that doesn't matter, that's still clear what you mean, is something not to worry about. Again, if you're writing on a whiteboard, you want to make sure that you have lots of room. But this also kind of applies to writing code, like leaving a bunch of space so your code's more readable, and maybe even drawing out comments to kind of lay out your function. Definitely keep an eye on time, and some of your decisions are going to need to be based off of the time. So, if you have a lot more time than you were given and you wrote up your solution and you didn't implement sort and search, time to do that. If you're running out of time and you don't feel like you can finish, write some helper functions to kind of fill in some of your code. If you have a really bad interview, it doesn't mean that you have no chance. You'll have another, a lot of times you'll have more than one tech interview. And so don't be discouraged if the first one didn't go well. And then the other case is that some people have to interview many, many times to get a job. So especially if you want to work at like a pretty competitive company, I've heard that people interview like 5 or 6 times before they get in. And so you don't have like strikes against you if things don't go wrong at all. There's really no way to get better at tech interviews than practice. So again, memorizing solutions doesn't help. Err on the side of over communicating. Even if you just compare Buvney and Sam's week interviews, like it kind of seemed like Sam was doing better because he was talking more. And it's always better to do more talking than not enough. Test your code and don't panic. You need to really stay focused during the process and believe that you can recall and know all of this stuff as you're working through the problem. And it really doesn't do you any good to think that you can't, because that's just extra emotional baggage that doesn't help you move forward. I would also just like, as like a side comment, is not every interviewer, most interviewers are really nice and they're wanting you to solve the problem. They're investing a lot of their time on interviewers or on interviews, and it's a lot of work. As you can tell, these take a lot of time. It's a big part of people's jobs. They want you to succeed in general, and they want to help you, and so they're going to do what they can to get you closer. But there are some people that are not going to be the nicest people interviewing you. So if you get people asking you things that are just rude, or pushing you on something that you've clearly indicated you don't know just to make you feel bad, or doing something that makes you nervous. I was at an interview once and I was killing it. I was really confident. I knew what I was doing, and the interviewer just started pacing back and forth on the back of the room. And after the interview, I said, "Why were you walking back and forth?" And he goes, "Oh, I was just trying to make you nervous. You seemed really confident." I'm like, why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. He didn't make me nervous because I was really focused on the problem and I did not care at all. But I would imagine someone who's just out of school or hasn't had a lot of experience solving problems in front of a bunch of people, which I had at the time, would be really thrown off by that, and it doesn't make any sense. And there will be people that do stuff like that, right? Interviewers are human and they're all different. So if you experience something bad where the person is not doing something that's helpful or is doing something that seems off, just know that they're not worth it, right? Like, it's no reflection on you, it's a reflection on them. And I hope none of you experience anything like that, but just know that you can. I also had some students the other week, I was doing an interview prep, and they said, "Oh yeah, the interviewer asked me these questions." And I'm like, why would they ask you those questions? The interviewer is asking them about terminology and having them define stuff. They were like, "Can you define what an interface is? Can you define what?" And I'm like, those are such bad questions. I wouldn't want to work for any company that asked me those questions. What are they getting out of that? That I'm like a dictionary? That doesn't make any sense. So know your own worth and know that you might experience interviews that are wrong on their side, not on your side, right? And if you have a really bad experience where someone is being particularly rude or asking you questions that don't make sense or making you feel less, they're not worth your time, So this is an interview for both of you. And so you need to like respect your own worth in your own self and not give people a chance if they are not treating you with respect. And definitely give that feedback to your recruiter. I know I've had experiences where interviewers have been rude, particularly interviewers who are younger. I've seen this before, like people who like just graduated and just started their positions. And I'm like, yes, I get an interview, and they're really like eager to do it. I've seen a couple of younger interviewers like put their feet up on the desk or like eat a piece of candy during the interview and like kind of show that they're like, a lot like that they're a lot better or something like that. I don't know how to explain it. And we gave that feedback. We were like, did you know that they're doing this? Like, is this what you want represented? Telling the recruiter this. And they were like, oh, that's terrible. Like, we can't have that person interviewing. You don't want to complain about things, but if you have a truly bad experience where someone is being inappropriate in that way, like not mature, not professional, you should tell a recruiter, because that doesn't happen. That should not be happening in industry, and it's totally inappropriate. I don't know. I just, this whole series is all about do this, do this, do this, don't do this. But the other side of the interview is human too. So just know that if you experience things, it's very possible. But generally, you'll have pretty good experiences, especially if you're at school, job fairs, or like student-focused career fairs. Like if you ever go to any of your national organizations' career fairs, you're really not going to see much of that. Those people are really seasoned, really good at recruiting events, and so you really rarely see that. But if you kind of go into a company more solo and apply kind of on your own, that's when you might see something like that a little bit more easily. Okay, so that is it for these kind of tips and common mistakes.